Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the New Ground Life and Leadership podcast. Today, I am joined by Rachel Turner and James Archer as we talk all things children's ministry and church. Just as an introduction, Rachel Turner is the founder of Parenting for Life and has worked in churches for over 15 years as a family life pastor, children's pastor, and a youth
Parenting for
pastor.
faith.
She runs training course. What are you saying, James? She runs
It's
training days
parenting
for.
for faith.
I just took it off your website, Rachel. I'm sorry.
It says
That's wrong.
parenting for life on my website. That's horrifying. Oh
Yeah.
no, now go check my website. It's parenting for faith. My attention to detail, evidently not great.
Oh, is it supposed to say parenting for a life of faith?
Yes,
Yes.
parenting for a life of faith.
Okay, let's start again. Sorry.
The organization is Parenting for Faith. The first book is called Parenting Children for a Life of Faith. So I don't know how it all got confused on my website, and I will go be checking that out later.
So the organization's right. You're the founder of Parenting for Faith.
Yes,
All
You
right.
said parenting for life.
you said
Did I?
Parenting for Life. Yes.
Which kind of
right.
is like
My,
the Christmas dog joke.
this is.
I cannot
this is-
possibly teach people how to parent for life. That's way too big. We got
Okay,
lower
sorry.
expectations.
I'm sorry. This was a mistake with my reading skills, not
Oh,
with
fine.
your website. So thank you for pointing out. I'll start again and try to read better. Rachel Turner is the founder of Parenting for Faith and has worked in churches for over 15 years as a family life pastor, children's pastor, and youth pastor. She runs training days for church leaders, consults and speaks at conferences on parenting and faith in the home. Rachel has produced the Parenting for Faith course and is the author of 10 books. James Archer. James Archer has worked in education for over 20 years and was a primary school educator and science advisor before becoming a senior lecturer in primary education at Canterbury Christ Church University. James gained his Doctor of Ministry in 2018 from York St. John's University. No, is that wrong?
No. I started it. I haven't got it. But I would greatly.
This is one of the best introductions I've ever done. Sorry. So you're, I'm pretty sure I just copied that off your website.
It
you've gained.
It definitely says that I started my but there we go.
Maybe okay, sorry about this.
No.
I like how our job is to be like we're less impressive than it sounds. That's what we keep saying.
Okay.
We want to stop the yeah.
James is now the CEO for the Institute of Children, Youth and Mission. That's right, isn't it?
It is.
And principal now. He has a new
Yeah.
title, a principal.
I'm principal and CEO now, yeah.
How exciting. Well, I'm sure we're going to hear more about the Institute for Children, Youth and Mission and being a principal and all that that involves in time to come. But I'm really excited to have you both with us today to talk about children's ministry and churches and faith and all of that with two experts in the field. I feel very out of my depth, but I've got a curious mind and I'm looking forward to seeing where you're going to go. And as a pastor in a church, I've got questions and problems that you're going to help me resolve and think through at the very least. So where should we start? Let's start perhaps, James, with you just sharing your observation of how you think many churches approach children's ministry in the UK, in the West today, and what you think should be done about it.
Wow. Big question. I think there are lots of different models at play as well. And I think one of the things that is beautiful is when you come into contact with somebody and talk children's ministry, you realize about 15 minutes into the conversation that you're talking about something very, very different. And so what you often have to do is deconstruct actually what is it that you're talking about. And I think some people would talk about children's and family ministry. Some people might just talk about ministry because we might just see a family unit as church and not discriminate between kind of age boundaries. So that there's lots and lots of different practice out there. There is a model that's kind of been established for a good couple of hundred years, which is the Sunday school model, which is actually the predominant model of ministry to children on a Sunday, which includes separation often from I feel like I'm probably more doctoring this rather than general speaking, but because everybody knows generally that children go out, but that doesn't happen everywhere, and I think that's something that's really important. So there's quite a lot of denominations that are exploring intergenerational ministry, and some, again, there's a spectrum of practice there, from an action song through to a commitment to genuinely entangling lives together, regardless of age. And so I think there isn't one model. There is probably a dominant model, which is that Sunday school which is often feels like it's connected with knowledge exchange or knowledge transfer. I've got some knowledge about the Bible, and we're going to learn about this man or woman from the Bible, and we'll tell them their story, because we talk about Bible stories, which is really interesting, because there is the whole story, but actually the Bible isn't just stories as well, which I think is really interesting when you come to teach something as a Sunday school worker, and you're like, oh, this isn't a story. How do I engage with this? Because this is a different type of text. But the Sunday school model often involves games and crafts, and I sit somewhere particularly with crafts where I'm probably a little bit anti-craft. I think I've probably OD'd on paper plates, and therefore I'm not entirely convinced that craft A, blesses the parent who has to find somewhere to put it at the end of the week, B, actually connects the child with Jesus 100% of the time. I think there are moments when we're crafting where people can connect with Father God, but I also think there are times when it's more about filling the activity. So for me, relationship and talk are the two foundational principles of what good quality children's ministry looks like, and then the mode or the method in which you try to cultivate that it is entirely up to you, and it's probably context specific, because there are the joy of the contextual theology. How is God calling us as a local people to reach children and young people, I think is really important. So but I think if we were brutally honest, that not a great deal of time from a senior leadership perspective is often spent about considering how are we actually raising the next generation, or how are we discipling children and young people, and how are we supporting families as a whole to engage in that discipleship. Is it up to those 50 hours across the year for a child to gain their entire church experience minus the holidays that they take throughout the year? Or is there another place in which the child can be supported to live a life of faith and be supported to engage? Rachel has this God connected and God smart principle that actually we can develop our knowledge, but actually are we actually God connected at all? I kind of would take that a little bit back a couple of 100 years to a guy called Pastor Losey, and I would think about the child's spiritual hands, heart, and head. And so, what is it the child's learning? How is their relationship? How are they connecting with God in their heart? But also, what skills are they developing? And I think for me, it's really important that we think about those kind of spiritual muscles. How are we equipping these children? Because the places in which they go and where they live their life are tough. I think kind of human existence has always been tough, but it's tough, particularly if you don't have any spiritual muscles. And so how are we helping that child grow holistically across those kind of boundaries of head, heart, and hand? And I think predominantly most modes of children's ministry sit comfortably in head, but heart and hands are often not necessarily an afterthought, but they're definitely the trickier ones to do, and I think it's because they require relationship and talk, and they need dialogue rather than monologue, and so we need to move into a kind of dialogic practice rather than monologic. I will read you a story and I will tell you what it means. We need to be question askers, and I love the way that you started saying that you've got lots of questions, because I think that's where children are too. I don't think we often start with the questions that children have, but I think that would be where I would start.
Great. I mean, so there's a lot there already into, but I guess to kind of, as I understand it, then you're saying that there's a broad range, a broad spectrum across the UK of the way that churches think about children's ministry. However, your observation is that you don't believe that the majority of senior leaders give much thought or time to the spiritual formation of their children, perhaps by and large. But
Which
and
is
then
a
also
big
that
challenge and a kind of a big thing just to lay there. But I think what would be interesting would be just to take a leadership team meeting and almost talk break down or record every kind of minute by minute.
I mean,
Children,
I think most people's experiences probably would just anecdotally, and most children's ministry workers anecdotally would probably agree with what you've said. So I don't think it's particularly controversial. I know the academic in you wants to cite some evidence for every statement that you make, but don't worry, just generalizations are fine sometimes. But I think generally that's been my experience. The senior leaders don't necessarily give a significant amount of time and leadership time and energy to thinking through the spiritual formation of their children. But then you also critiqued actually the method and approach to discipling young people is often perhaps a little bit too just formed on the you use a posh word, like not dialogical, like transferring of information. Transferring of information to someone's head rather than considering the person holistically. And I love, well, there's lots there we want to pick up about development of spiritual muscles and things. Now, Rachel, I know you travel the country speaking at different conferences and have no doubt seen lots of different expressions of children's work and ministry in different settings. Are you encouraged, concerned, worried, hopeful about what you see by and large across the UK with the way that Christians are thinking about discipling the next generation of young people? What are your reflections on some of this to start us off?
I think I'm always encouraged, because for me, I always see more and more people becoming interested in what's going on, and I see the heart behind it. And so for me, sometimes we can bemoan the practice, but sometimes you pick up that practice just because that's what you've always done, or that's what the model that you see most, or the first thing you Google is a craft, and so you think, aha, this is what I should do. And what I think is really important, what's happening now in the country, is we're really beginning to look at how to disciple children and young people around the wholeness of who they are. It's not just how do we deliver a great 1 hour on a Sunday, because children's discipleship was never meant to center on a church service. That is never biblically the way that children were designed to be discipled. And so we're beginning to move away from how do we make this hour great, and we're moving into how do we take seriously the spiritual life of a child and young person, and how do we help them individually connect with God? How do we support their parents to walk alongside them in the ordinary every day? How do we become a church that integrates them well so that they are the church of now, both in participating in relationships, participating in service, participating in mission? And we're beginning to say these are full disciples called to fully live according to Jesus' principles. And we as a church cannot be who we're called to be without them. So how do we do that well? And that's the conversation we're having, and that's the equipping that we're having. And so I don't bemoan it. I want more people to embrace it and more people to step into what's possible, because we all share the same heart, which is seeing a kid walk alongside God for a lifetime. And the more tools we can give them to see that fruit now, the more I think we're going to see beautiful things.
That's really helpful and encouraging. Just one thing, maybe as a kind of starting place, there may be some, not resistance, but maybe some questions in people's minds when it comes to children and faith generally, because we all know kids are susceptible to, like adults, really susceptible to believe whoever's got the coolest thing, or whoever convinces them uses the most impressive persuasive techniques to convince them of something. Kids can be, you can convince a child to put their hand up for Jesus or for sweets or for anything. So just kind of lay for us some foundations or evidences or just examples of how you've seen children from a young age having a meaningful relationship with Jesus, and even what that looks like as distinct perhaps from adult faith. Any comments on that, either of you?
I think one of the importance, like you're talking there about the kind of propositional gospel type method, potentially, which is again kind of one of those core tenets of the historic Sunday school model. I think if you take a more explorative approach with children, then the greater the authenticity of faith. We're involved in a church plant, a Catholic church plant in Bradford, and we're using the disciple making movement, discovery Bible studies, and so we're wholly intergenerational, if or intergen as the cool kids call it. Sometimes that's kind of by design, but I also, as part of learning from a historic church plant as well, I think. And through that, where actually you've got the Discovery Bible study that asks me to respond to the scripture. So you've got core questions. There's 7 questions that make up the whole 4 core questions that actually ask me to respond. And when the child's asked to respond to a question that says something like, what does this tell me about God? What does this tell me about me? If this is God's word, what am I going to do with it? It's amazing the kind of responses that we have. And I think for my children particularly going through this, they are reading more Bible than they ever have done before. We don't print out colouring sheets. We don't have crafts. We don't really, we're not highly sensory. We're talk based. They're in a room where actually reflection on the Bible is happening, and being in a community that is reflecting on God's word together, rather than having knowledge just kind of transferred from one individual. They're seeing that actually everybody around them is grappling with what God's word says, but they're thinking about who they can share it with and how they're going to apply it personally to them and their lives and their situation. So one of the responses as a result of reading about Jesus getting baptized, my 2 oldest were like, I think actually I know that I'm not baptized. So if I'm saying that I'm a follower of Jesus, and then maybe I should be exploring baptism. So hopefully when it warms up and in the garden, we will be doing some baptisms this summer. And I think that is the really important thing. Like, you can present the gospel in many different ways, and there are some brilliant resources to present a gospel message, but talk and questioning and enabling the child to explore for themselves, supported in a community of believers, I believe is the most authentic way to support and nurture faith.
Rachel, what are some of your thoughts on that question, or what James has just said?
I think it's really easy, and this has happened for quite a while, that we idealize children's faith. And so we sort of say, oh, children have easier faith, or they're more innocent. And those people tend to have not worked with children for very long, because children are brutal. I mean, if your logic is flawed in any way, they are on it. And you can tell stories from your life and they're like, well, it doesn't happen in mine, and they'll shut you down harder than anything. And so I think we tend to idealize what we think children's faith is, as if they have it easier, or as if they just naturally follow along. I think you're right in what you said, that we can sort of manipulate children into raising their hand for sweets or anything, but that doesn't mean we're actually seeing heart change. And so to me, that means we can get their conformity in a room, but that doesn't mean we're actually discipling their relationship with Jesus. And so that's the call on us, is to say, these are full disciples now. And so how do we walk alongside them in their faith? And so for me, it is about empowering their voice, and helping them authentically talk with God. I was working with some kids and their families on chatting to God. I call it chatting, because it just gets around to everyone's baggage around the word prayer. I'm lazy. So we get around the word prayer, and I just call it chatting to God. And there was a child who had suffered real trauma, fostered child, real trauma, 4-year-old, wouldn't talk to anybody about it, wasn't talking to the therapist about it. And they had one of those baby monitor things in the room. And the parents would see the kid regularly. He'd set up a little table with tea and would play cars and drink tea and would talk, and they could hear him talking. And then when they turned up the monitor, they could hear that he was talking to Jesus about his life and what happened and how he feels about his dad. And it was this really powerful thing that for a child who couldn't talk to anybody about the trauma he'd suffered, he talked to the God who had been with him in those times. And when it was time for the child to go to his forever family and get adopted, the kid said, don't worry about it, because Jesus was here with me now and he's going to go with me. And so I'll always talk to Jesus. I'll have Jesus always. And there's something really powerful about giving a child a full relationship with God and understanding who he is in God's eyes and where God is and that whole process. And so you see that realness and the need, because our kids live complex lives. And so you can see that with a 4-year-old. I was talking to a 9-year-old who was getting bullied, and we were doing some prayer ministry, and she began to really feel a burden for the person who was being cruel to her and who was attacking her. And she asked God for pictures of what that child's life was like, and God gave her a picture of this girl laying on the ground bleeding and her family laughing at her. And so she was like, she just started interceding for this child who had targeted her and was attempting to really just tear at the heart of how she sees herself. And instead, this kid was praying for her and interceding for her because she saw her the way Jesus saw her. And to me, that is the joy of walking alongside God, is they have these full needing lives of a God who walks alongside of them, and to live a discipled life that causes them to flourish. And they need that now. And we need to help them find that now. But also, to me, walking alongside those kids, I, as an adult, need that encouragement. How often do I intercede for people or colleagues or people that I run into who are deliberately targeting me? And how often do I sit around and say, I need to chat with Jesus over tea about the stuff that really matters? There's some really important things that we can learn, not because they're children, but because they're disciples. And we need their stories just like they need ours.
That's really good. And of course, it's a kind of slightly unfair question in that we all know it's just as easy to manipulate an adult behavior into behavioral conforming to a particular social norm. And you see this in church all the time. It's just that young people are often not quite as good at hiding it as adults are. Our goal is to make disciples of people, and that it's always going to be hard to measure exactly what that looks like, because so much of it is an internal disposition towards God and a private cultivating of life with God. And when it is too manifestly public, then actually Jesus is quite critical of that. It's like, well, just be careful of that, because you do that for people or for God. And that's the dynamic we face, not just with children, but with adults as well. James, I mean, I love some of the kind of grenades and stuff that you're throwing out as well, and your critique of different approaches to children's ministry. But you're quite big on and keen on the idea of seeing the importance of children as valid members of the church family, rather than just a kind of a babysitting community that we have to kind of tolerate while the adults have their lecture. Talk to us a bit more about your philosophy of how you think churches ought to think about children within their community.
Well, I think that the challenge, like,
why did Rachel just shot guns at you? I'm not quite sure.
I was like, yeah, go James.
I think for me, like, the first step is actually having a conversation about it, kind of at church level, senior leadership level. Like, where does the child sit, and what is do we have a theology of childhood in place? Do we actually do we understand childhood is actually, as in terms of a construct, is a relatively new one. We have the Victorians to thank for that. And so before that, there was kind of old and young, but childhood and childhood innocence, as Rachel alluded to, is a really relatively young concept. But if we are there in thinking actually child is separate and different, then potentially we need to have some kind of questions or thoughts about kind of what is our theology of childhood. I love liberation theology, and I identify with those Jesuits from South America that are talking about oppression and the poor, because a lot of my reading, research, and writing has kind of said actually it is the child within the contemporary church an oppressed people group. Some people will automatically turn off as soon as they hear that. But I question that and wonder actually whether that child is an oppressed people group. And some of my thinking in and around that is, does the child have full participatory rights into the church community, or is childhood a phase which they have to graduate from in order to get full access, full participatory rights? If you hold membership as an ideal, can a child become a member of your church, or does the child need to be 16 or above to be a member of your church? And what does that say to the child? And for me, liberating the child is listening to the child's voice and giving it agency, enabling the child to act within the church setting. And I think it can be really simple in actually saying that we're all going to talk about things together. And then the child has full access, because if actually we've got a talk-based church model and the child is allowed to do that, the child has access. But actually, if anytime the child has to ask permission or is separated off to enable something else to happen, then potentially the child hasn't got full participatory rights. There are legitimate reasons why people might say, actually, I do believe childhood should be separate, and that actually a child should grow in the ways of the Lord. It kind of there's kind of a whole load of Old Testament scripture that we could talk about training and developing. But one of my questions is, how come the adult who becomes a new convert in their 40s almost instantly gets those full participatory rights, but that child who's done 10, 15 years has to wait until a number to get full access and to participate within the church? And so I don't think anybody has to believe what I believe about children and children's role within the church, but I do think we need to have honest and frank conversations about that. That Helen, I can't remember her surname now, but it will probably come to me. She talks about the 4 voices of theology, and often when we talk about the doctrinal, she talks about the espoused and the operant. So what we say is that what we say is the same as what we do, and often in church we're very good at saying what we believe, but actually the things that we do, our theology in action is different. So if we say that everybody's invited to the table, but actually there are quite a few churches that the child isn't invited to take part into communion until there's been a route to access, for example. So is what we say, what we believe, actually what we do? And is the child and childhood something that we have to grow out of? Or if Jesus was really interested in children and suggesting that we should become more like them, is there something that we should be learning from? And is there a place of potential repentance there about the way in which
There's a lot of that what you just shared there, just a reflection on how we think about the household, that we talk about age of adulthood and the responsibility. Children remain the responsibility of their parents. It's not that we're excluding children, but recognizing an established authority structure in the home, which I know in an individualistic, heavily egalitarian society like ours, this feels like the natural next step along this kind of journey. But I would suspect that that's the reason why children, and obviously the Apostle Paul's restrictions around non-believers and the communion meal and etc. So what were some of your reflections on that?
Yeah, I think what's interesting to me is that a child can often profess belief but be restricted from communion, and I think that was the situation that I was talking about, not a child as a non-believer accessing communion, but actually within the gathered church, there can be barriers for the child to access communion. And how many times do we take part in communion within the children's groups? And why is that? Is one of my questions. So actually, is it something that we don't believe is for children? And again, we might get down to that point and say, actually, no, we don't think that until you are 16, 18, 20, you can have an authentic relationship with Jesus. But you might, I think one of the challenges, as I've been thinking about the child and childhood, is actually, is there anything that we are, as church, are just doing because we've always done it, that blocks or stops, halts or hinders a child's relationship with Jesus? And I think there are. And I think a lot of that is because we actually don't have a localized theology of childhood. We just do it.
That's very helpful. I mean, there's so much in there that you've said that's really thought-provoking. Rachel, what's some of your comments on anything that James has said?
I agree with James, but I also think that we often don't just see the children as disciples, because even if you take the basic thing, if you ask any church leader, what is your discipleship plan for adults? They have a really well thought out thing. They're like, we want people to come in, we want them to start serving immediately so that they can integrate, because it's about belonging and it's about welcome. We want them to join a small group where they can consistently be vulnerable with people. They have this full plan for it, because they say, for an individual disciple of Jesus, this is what we think they need to do. They need to come in, they need to get in relationship with people, they need to serve, they need to cultivate. And they absent children from that process. And they go, and for kids, we have a room where they can have a good time and hear about Jesus and maybe pray. And they don't even apply the basic just principle of discipleship journey and say, our discipleship journey for everybody is that you come in, you serve, you integrate, you find a small group of people that you can be vulnerable with. Just that process. We don't say we want that for everybody in our church. This is what we believe a disciple does. We say this is what adults do, and then children might be different, and I don't know, and what activities can we do to get them in, and we treat them as a completely different being. And they're not. They're disciples too, who need to serve and who need to be in intergenerational relationships and need to be what everybody else does. So even just as church leaders, to consider that in church leadership, we are called to every individual within our church. And we consider that they need the fullness of discipleship in the way that everybody does. I think that would change our practice a lot, because I don't think when rubber hits the road, I'm an anthropologist. And so in anthropology terms, we have ideal culture and real culture in the way that James was describing. And I don't think when rubber hits the road that we actually consider children disciples, because we certainly don't treat them like that. And that was the big challenge for me.
Wow, that's really helpful. And this isn't just like an interesting discussion around children's ministry. There's a crisis facing the Western church, isn't there? That 50% of children raised in Christian homes don't continue. Only 50% continue their faith into adulthood. And the church's response to that, by and large, has been, let's employ a children's worker and let's put on some more games. Which I'd love to hear your reflections on that stat and the general crisis facing the church in the West, and what you think the church should be doing to wake up and face that reality.
Well, I think there's two things in this. One thing is that since the beginning of time, we've been intergenerational in terms of our faith development of families. So from the very beginning, there wasn't a children's ministry strand to the Exodus. We just all left. And so through all of history, it's been intergenerational faith formation. It's been families living together. It's been a child within a family who has been passionate about God and deliberate about discipling their child within a faith community that fully integrated children into the faith experiences. It's how God decided it. Paul was writing to churches assuming that children were in the room. When he speaks, children obey your parents, it's because he assumed that children were in the room when it was happening. Jesus was preaching intergenerationally. And it was only when, as James spoke a couple of 100 years ago, where we started Sunday schools, but those started in the afternoons. It wasn't until the 1940s, 50s that Sunday school moved en masse to the mornings. And that's when the sort of, James, you jump in if I'm saying things wrong.
No. I was going to say that it was also the Sunday school movement was birthed out of meeting the needs of people that weren't already going to church. It was actually, how can I share something of Jesus to somebody who needs something to do, a child who needs something to do, who isn't accessing this, but obviously schooling is such a loaded word anyway, and I think it's possibly the route in which we need to kind of, are we schooling these children, are we discipling? And I think that's probably part of where the crux of the problem lives, because actually discipleship it just goes so much deeper than the surface level.
Exactly, because when it started, it was also for education purposes, because those kids were in factories and they couldn't go to school. So it was a sort of social evangelistic outreach thing, and primarily kids who weren't already attending with their families in church. That was all intergenerational. So by the time it moves in the morning, that was when we switched from it being a primary evangelistic thing to siphoning off children from the intergenerational experience. And so that's when we began to lose the skill of talking about faith with each other, and lose the skill of discipling those around us, and lose the skill of doing faith side by side. We began to silo us out. It became a specialism, and it became something that we needed to focus on differently. And so we're now 2 or 3 generations down the line of older generations not knowing how to talk to younger generations about faith, the expertising of children's spirituality and youth spirituality, and then learning parenting has been completely radicalized since the 1940s in terms of expertise. Now we have all these books and how you're supposed to do it, and we've stopped learning how to parent from living next to your mom and down the road from your gran and learning how to parent. We're all learning how to parent sort of new and fresh and innovating it, which means we've lost the skill of, how do I parent my kid for faith? Because this is how I was parented for faith, and this is how my great grandma parented my mom for faith. And we begin to lose that. And so we've fractured. And so when I'm looking at 50% of Christian kids don't continue on in their faith, what I see is the breakdown of the way that discipleship was always meant to be. It's parents confidently and proactively discipling their kids. When you talk to most parents, they're afraid, or they're worried, or they're like, I'm new to faith, I don't know how to do this, or I don't want to shove it down their throat. And so trying to develop this confidence and skill again in parents of how to walk alongside their kids and disciple them in the ordinary every day, not necessarily feeling like they have to do devotionals or do church at home, which has become the new model, but how do we help them actually side by side disciple their kids? And how do we re-empower congregations to be that intergenerational side by side community? Not a lot of older generation feel like they can walk up to 4 13-year-old girls and know how to have a conversation, or feel like they would have anything to input into them. And we have younger generations desperate for older people to see them, know them, love them, walk alongside of them. And we have older generations who feel like they're useless and unneeded because we've siphoned off into these generations. And so I look at that stat and I say, yeah, that's what happens when the discipleship model falls apart. We all need that kind of surroundings around us to flourish.
Yeah, I mean, go on, James.
No, I was just going to say, like, kind of on the kind of, and what about the specialist bit as well? What's been really interesting is the specialist has been a lay leader often, not, we might kind of say the children's worker, it could be a deacon, and there's a deacon level ministry. So we kind of say we know that we need somebody who actually has a real heart and gifting for children, young people, family stuff, but we place them almost on the next tier down, or the tier down below that. And I think where the specialist sits, if you want to affect change and if you want to grow as an entire community, is that actually you've got to think about your leadership structure as a church leadership and ask yourself, where is the children's young people specialist sat, and are they in the room? I mean, that they're often the children's worker, employed or not, is often the prophet, reminding you to remember the children, because they can be the other half of the church. Remember the children, but if they're not in the room, they can't make that call. So actually, where do we think leadership of children sits? Is it, if you have an eldership structure, is it an eldership responsibility, children and young people? Is it an eldership role? And does it require a token elder who has the role and then has somebody underneath them that they pass stuff down? Or actually, is there somebody who in quite a lot of our churches, it can be 50% of the congregation? Is it somebody who's actually taking that responsibility for that sizable chunk of the congregation? I think when we met last time, Jez, I was like, it's often your largest unreached people group as well as a church. And so if the person who's leading that isn't involved at a senior level, I guess my question would be, why is that? And what impact do you think that might be having?
Yeah, and I think, of course, the reality is another stat is that 92% of adult churchgoers say that they attended church occasionally as children. So almost everybody in church as an adult is there because they had some faith involvement as a child. And so if as church leaders we're interested in reaching lost people, well, we better invest in our youth work and our children's work. And it's investing in that. Even that language is like, it's the language of, we need to hire a staff member, or we need to put on some good programs for them. Whereas I really like all that you guys are saying, because it's just a lot more provocative than that. It's like, no, we need an entirely new way of conceiving of who we are as the people of God. And actually, like, just the reflection, I think, on how churches have changed in their approach to children is probably, would you say, a reflection on how society's changed with the way that it thinks about children. I was talking to someone recently who was quoting to me Pope John Paul II's essay about a culture of death, that in the West we're a culture of death. We don't value life. We want everything neat and orderly and tidy. We don't like dysfunction or mess, or just and children by their very nature are lively and full of energy. They don't fit our boxes, and we despise that generally as a society, is what Pope John Paul says, I think. And then by and large the church then just kind of mirrors, well, this is how the society feels about and treats children, therefore that's how we'll arrange our gatherings to reflect that. What are some of your thoughts on even that statement, the culture of death, and society's attitude towards children and the overspill into church?
I think, if I'm honest, I think it's often look back to help. It's helpful for us to look back to look forward. So I think there's been peaks and troughs of interest in children and childhood over time. And I think if you were to look potentially at a post-war era, not just as a from a church perspective, but from a society perspective, that actually kind of post-World War II, there are lots of people that are going, we need to focus on the young people and grow a whole new generation, and with a new mindset that says that this can never happen again. So you have people like the wonderful Maria Montessori, who's working in the slums of Italy, trying to work out actually what does it look like to actually be in that child's world and support the child, and study the child, observe the child, to see how I can actually be the person that facilitates them. I'm not going to just give program to you. I'm going to actually understand you and watch you and be part of your journey so that I can work out what your next steps are. And I think that with any culture or any society, there are often moments of affluence that mean that you potentially the pressures become less. And I think there probably will come a time again where actually there will be a time where we say, actually, we need another generation that's totally different from what's gone before it. And part of my kind of regular prayer is make that time now, that we would have that sense of urgency. Society, again, I think is hard to generalize about how society views children and childhood, but I think there is a greater awareness of individuality out there that I think is healthy and helpful when we try and understand childhood. So I think there is a greater interest in understanding an individual and what makes them tick than ever has done before. I think there's a greater awareness of being vulnerable. All our discussions about mental health, and like the church has such an opportunity now post-COVID to be there for children, and to have trauma-informed ministry, but also minister into the places where children and young people are, with therapeutic trauma-informed practices, and be a beacon of hope from that point of view. So I think there are pockets of society that maybe would go along with John Paul, but I think there are others that. But I think having earnest prayers that we would see another generation or a new generation that has done things that we haven't seen before, or experienced things that we've not experienced before, is really, really important.
Rachel,
I would argue, I would argue that we're all. I hate this. I'm going to say this badly, so don't jump on my words, but I think in some ways we're lagging behind society in our value of children within the church. Sometimes, I look at our young people and I think at school, they're empowered, they're invited into leadership places, they're told to take responsibility for their lives and their actions. They're told that, they're inspired to pioneer and to do things. And then they come to church and we're like, you can help with the, AV rota, but not be responsible for it. But you come and sit next to the person who is, and we see them and employ them as less powerful than they are encouraged to be in the world around them, at school, at church. And that always breaks my heart. That to me, we have the chance to look at them and say, we see you and value you and encourage you to be everything that God has created you to be, with everything that God has called you to be, and to be a part of this amazing mission. And yet we often set them aside and disempower them in a way that the world has been pushing them forward and we've been holding them back. It's been a real challenge for me to look at that.
Yeah, I mean, you guys, it just feels so instinctively right, so much of what you're saying, and the challenge so kind of needs to be heard. Rachel, perhaps we could come to talk then a little bit, not just in critiquing the church's need to rethink perhaps how we make disciples of young people, but I know you've written books on helping parents raise children for a life of faith, and you mentioned there that parents are often scared, they don't quite know what to do, what's expected of them, or should they just try to repeat what happens on a Sunday in their homes? What would be some of your encouragement and advice and support to parents who are, because again, we would say that the primary responsibility for discipling young people rests with the parents, not with the children's minister, no matter how much you pay them. So how do we help parents grab hold of that and see that as a worthwhile vision for their parenting?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we begin to encourage this with parents. I wrote a book called It Takes a Church to Raise a Parent, because I think there's a really interesting interplay between churches and parents. Because if the church has become in people's heads the expert, then it's this really empowering thing as an expert that we can do to say, actually, you've got this and we believe in you and we're for you. And so I often talk about with parents need vision and they need skills. And often our default to give vision is to say like, you too can gather your 4 children around a table and read the Bible together. And most parents are like, there's no way on God's green earth that I will be able to do that. I will therefore fail. And we set up the sort of vision of what the model could look like. And I'm much more towards, we need to start casting a vision of what's possible for their relationship with God. We need to start telling stories of children's faith lives, and we need to empower the children's voices, because once you start hearing a 4-year-old talk about how he talks to Jesus about trauma, or hear a 12-year-old talking about how she's been interceding for something, you think, I want that for my kid. That's what I want. You know, if we say all the promises of God are for our children, then, you know, I want my dyslexic child to be able to walk into a school test with knowing that God's hand is on their back. Like, we need those stories of the impact God makes in their lives. That's the vision to start seeding in. And often I run into church leaders who go, I don't have those stories. And that's something to pursue. If you don't have those stories, then find those stories, you know, and get into relationship with people, pursue those things, so we can start telling stories and empowering children to tell their own stories of a life filled with Christ, because that's the motivation to then learn the skills to do it. And then parents need the skills, not skills to how to do a thing, you know, how to do a Bible study, how to do those things. That can be helpful, but most of the skills that I try to equip congregations and parents to do is things like, how do you create windows into an authentic life with God? How do you say, I'm really struggling because grandma is sick and we've been praying for healing and I haven't seen her healing yet. And that makes me sad sometimes. And when I'm sad, I tell God, I'm really sad that you haven't healed her, God, but I see that you've called us to pray. So I'm going to keep praying. How do we live that? Because I don't think it's natural anymore to talk about the ups and downs of life in front of your children, because we think we've got to show them that Christianity is great. And how do we actually live that authentic life in front of them and let them have windows? How do we frame for them where we see God in difficult things like terrorist attacks and in media? How do we help unwind the wrong views of God that they get because they're interacting at school and life and friends? How do we walk along how they see God so they can want to encourage him? So I teach 5 key tools to parents that are those kind of things. How do we do that? And as congregation members, as leaders, we can drip feed those skills. We can integrate it into services. We can give parents the confidence to say, I don't need to be perfect at this. I just need to commit to walk alongside my kid so that they can have the fullness of life, because I know what that might look like. And I know that just me being me, imperfect, I can help them find their path with God. And that's the approach to have with parents.
I mean, presumably there's been studies done, have there, on what it is that's really necessary to help children adopt a faith for themselves as adults?
Yes.
What are some of the kind of findings from that really make an impact on a child's faith development?
Yes, James can quote things better than I can quote. But do you want to? Well, there's loads of studies. Olwen Mark did a survey of over 50 studies on the discipleship of children. It's called the Theos Report, and predominantly it's a engaged parent who is proactively discipling the child's journey, to walk alongside the child's journey. So a parent who's open, a parent who is not focused on information, but on helping a child find their own path with God, and a church community who supports, encourages, and releases them. So it's about being surrounded by an intergenerational community. A book called Sticky Faith talks a lot about the importance of having other adults, not your parents, involved in an intergenerational web around children, and having them engaged in a church community that's wider than themselves. Sort of all of those factors of a child being treated as a disciple, family around them who is proactive and confident, and a church community who integrates them so that they can stay connected in. James, do you want to jump on in?
Yeah, no, I like, if anybody wants to read about bits and pieces, like I would kind of Dale and Mail. I can only remember them because they rhyme. But
Dale and Mail.
Dale and Mail is the surnames of the authors. They often do work, particularly for the Church of England, looking at the status of faith. Every couple of years, they kind of put out a paper again, which is always really interesting. And again, the same thing has kind of come up, that the faith is declining, but there are pockets of good practice, and actually those are swelling pockets, etc., etc. Sarah Holmes's work. I wish I could remember the name of her website, but she's based at Liverpool Home, and she did a whole load of really interesting studies in around COVID and the impact of the pandemic on children, family, health, faith, and discipleship. And again, it's those threads of it's really important to talk and spend time with one another that come through her work. And so it's like we can invest a lot in shiny lights and curricula and stuff like that, but for me, those core principles of talk and relationship those are the things that are really important. The fact that the child knows that they can ask any question and nothing's off the topic, but also then reading the word together inspires questions, and so going through those questions that the children raise. I do a little kind of session about, actually, you don't need to buy a curriculum for several £100s. You just need to listen to the children, and if you got all the questions you put from one session, you've probably got a whole year's worth of planning there. Let's explore all of the questions that these children have,
or even just let it go in the session like that. I'm on Sundays doing a lot with our years 6 and 7s and 8s, and I'll plan something, but you get about 5 minutes in and we're off on 1,000 different questions of things, and that has become so joyful. It's just 45 minutes of trying to decide and answer, and how you answer these questions, and what does that look like for you. And I think sometimes if we are still in it's my job to put information into your head, that feels stressful. Otherwise, you're just sitting in a room with a bunch of disciples who have questions that I can answer, not answer, or we can call somebody who's smarter than us and find it out. And there's a real joy and relaxation to just following the questions where they go, and have the conversation of what pops up in your mind. So many times when you're trying to deliver something, you try to shut down questions because you're like, I have a teaching point. But just to come together and to teach a little bit until there's something that comes up that the conversation wants to be about is a really great thing to do.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, if we're trying to establish genuine faith and connection between a child and God for themselves, then the way that occurs is by inviting curiosity and exploration, not by just telling them this is the narrow lane within which you have to stay. Because we know, don't we, when we're discipling adults, or just even in our own life, like giving people the freedom to just ask questions and not know the answer to those questions is part of how we are then invited into exploration of those questions throughout our life in a meaningful relationship with God. And I think sometimes, with kids, we feel the pressure more so than with adults, perhaps, but we feel the pressure to have the answers to all the questions, rather than saying, I mean, whenever my kids ask me a question, I'll try to avoid answering it and just say, what a great question. Let's have more questions like that. You go away and think about that, because that's a brilliant question. But James, I mean, you mentioned the Discovery Bible method. Obviously, there's 6 questions there. Who is God? Or does this tell me about God, rather? What does it tell me about me? So you can perhaps list those questions quicker than I can, or better than I can. Not quicker. We're not talking about speed of recovery. But even just in inviting families to consider reading a passage from the Bible and saying, look, here's 6 questions that will undoubtedly invite some level of discussion. And what are those 6 questions, James?
However
many questions.
So often we start off asking about how our weeks were. So and then, is there anything that we can help with, just as our kind of a starting point. And then, if this is the second or subsequent week, we ask, did you do what you said you were going to do? And did you tell who you said you were going to tell? Then we read the scripture, normally in 3 different types, 3 different versions. And there's so many beautiful versions. I really love both the NLT and the Passion for working with children. I think the Jesus Storybook Bible is also amazing, and can cause deep revelation that just makes you weep for days when you well done, Sally. So
Can I
reading.
just interject here also that those when we think about what's good for children, it's also good for people with less educational backgrounds, some illiterate backgrounds. I think sometimes we say children, but it's also accessible to other people too.
And I think for anyone who's become over familiar with Jesus's parables, so they become dead, and actually anything like Sally's work, I like that I'm on first name terms with Sally now as well. Sally's work that kind of it just shows the truth in fresh ways through the lens of the gospel. Sorry, James, carry on.
Definitely. So we read it 3 times. We shut the scripture and we try and retell it together as a whole. And sometimes this is where maybe the resources can come out. And I would have just a box of spare parts or wooden shapes or bits that we've kind of foraged, and we kind of try and retell with those bits. Not everybody's into that kind of thing, so we can just use our voices and just retell together. And being people's story is so important for who we are, and so actually retelling the story together is a really powerful moment. And then we reflect on, what does this tell me about God? And what does this tell me about people? And often there are some nice kind of little overlaps there that we can explore together. Really simple questions. And then we ask, if this is really God's word, what am I going to do? And then if we have a moment of kind of, what is the response? And sometimes when we've got children in our groups, actually it's really helpful asking follow-up questions like, so where do you find that in scripture? Let's open it again, and let's try and ground what it is that you're going to do in what we've read. So we're not telling them what they should do, but we're kind of drawing them back, because sometimes you do get the curveball that you're like, okay, right, or the generic, well, this week I'm going to pray. You're like, right, okay, what kind of prayers are we going to look at, or what else are we going to do? And then who am I going to tell? So which and being ready to be the person that can tell what we've been reading together as a group is somebody without faith is really important. Amazing. And then that is the simple structure, and so as church we don't have a sermon or a preach or anything like that. Our worship is often simply basic, but with that, the principle of actually, if we are going to radically see this nation come to know Jesus, can we afford to do it the way that we're currently doing it? Probably not. How can we actually disciple people in a way that is replicatable? Is the root point, Rachel?
No, that was sorry. I apologize. I sent a little chat message which then distracted you. I apologize, but that was exactly what I think. This is something particularly for us in a church planting movement who are passionate about church planting. I travel all around the country and work with lots of different denominations, and the thing that binds people up, and when you think about planting a new church, is how do we start children's ministry, and when do we start children's ministry, and we want to value the kids, so should we do that? And then how do we get volunteers when there's only 24 of us? And I think there's something about, one, if we want to see revival, and 1,000 people are going to show up at your church tomorrow, I don't want the agony to be, we have no idea of how to get how do we put them all in a room? Our building isn't big enough. And so there's something of, if we're passionate about highly replicating something, if we're passionate about saying there's a place there, let's church plant, if we're passionate about raising disciples who can disciple, then creating a model where everyone can be skilled to disciple everybody in the room, without needing to think, how do we provide children's ministry for this, I think is a really big question for us, particularly as a movement. Because I think if we say, oh, that's a special skill, intergenerational is a special skill that we need someone to do, then we're not enabling disciples who can raise disciples who can throw everybody in a house church and disciple everyone together. I think it's a big, important thing for us to get our brains around.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think in rethinking the models of how we do stuff is really important. So there's a range of different things. James, I just love you. I mean, I love what you're saying. I just sitting here just imagining my kids sitting down with other people and their kids to do this Bible reading and questions. And I can't get them to sit still for longer than 2 or 3 minutes. So we're a church with like, in one year we had 7 babies born, and they were all boys. We're a small church, and so we find ourselves just overcome with, 30 boys under 11 just wanting to play football all the time. The thought of getting some of those together to sit in a room and have these discussions, I lack help my faith, James. What do you do to facilitate an environment where children will sit with adults and discuss this sort of thing?
Think environment is really important. So thinking about how you're going to structure it. Well, I'm not going to say that our Sundays aren't noisy, because they are. And B, I'm not saying that those that can't read are engaged as much as those that can. But I think what's really interesting is that actually we're shifting the responsibility from me being responsible for your faith as the children's worker to you, child. Actually, if you did you do what you said you were going to do? Have you told who you said you were going to tell? You're responsible for your faith. I'm not telling you what you're going to do. You decided what you were going to do. So ownership is really important. That links back to the agency bits and pieces, but creating that favorable environment is really important. So actually, one of the things that we started off doing, I was trying to do lots of different groups. That didn't work because there was too much noise. And there was a bit of me that was a primary school teacher going, I don't think this is going to work, doing lots of different groups, talking all at the same time. So one table is my biggest kind of, seems to be the biggest way that work. So actually, if we're all sat round together so that we can see each other, that's really important. We can all
sat
hear
around a
each other.
table, not just sat around sofas.
Yeah, I think sat around a table is really helpful because it's a good resting place for the Bible. And we can do scribbling notes or writing at the same time. Sometimes we actually just write on the table because it's got plastic on it, and that's fine. But one table all together, and I think again, without kind of being fully revealing my Montessorian fanboying, but she talked about the importance of creating the environment that nurtures particular sponsors, and so actually, who owns the environment? Who's doing the packing away and the setting up? Because actually, it probably should be the children if it's their environment. That's really important. Like, does somebody come early and get all these boxes out and put it all out? And then does somebody stay away afterwards and have to pack it away, and it's all a nightmare afterwards? Making sure that there's a clear, organized environment is really, really important. And then setting high expectations as well, as actually this is what we're going to do. And I think narrating kind of the kind of where we're going next and what we're aiming for is really important. But actually grace and courtesy was a fundamental part of the Montessori curriculum, and she believed that you could learn that from actually creating the right physical environment. That actually, if the physical environment was something that we all really, really loved, then actually it's something that we would all really, really respect, and we'd respect all of those that are in there. So it's not easy when you're trying to change a culture or bring in new practice, but I think having high expectations, thinking about actually how do you facilitate the right environment for this to happen, I think that's really important.
That's really helpful.
I think there's something really crucial in what James is saying, is that I think our children in church environments have been taught and therefore have embraced and now have an internal culture of the fact that this isn't for them. So they show up and they're like, this isn't for me. This is an adult thing. I'm either waiting for my bit, or or this whole thing is just something I have to endure. And so they're already disengaged when you walk in. And so for me, when you're changing a church culture, there is what you change from the front, but you could do the best, most accessible service. But if you have a culture within your kids of them shutting down, disengaging, and not this being for them, then it can get quite sad, because you're like, we're trying, but they're not, because there's been a culture that for their whole lives has been in, and they've got to experience this new way of being seen and valued and heard and being a part of something, and that it's not for them. They don't show up, and it's, their job is to participate. And so that does take a journey for children. It's not just we put on a new environment and their behavior instantly changes. Often it's taking a culture of people to learn to build trust with them that they come and this is their place. It's taken a year of one of the groups I'm working on with the youth for them to get that I'm not going to tell them the right answer. We're going to ask a question, and genuinely we'll go wherever your thoughts go. But that's taken months of building trust with them, that's what it really is about.
And I think it's
really
value as well. Like, again, without trying to be controversial, how much value do we all put on the Sunday school or Sunday provision? Or are we really trying to check them in the quickest via church suite? So we're going to arrive a little bit early so that we've logged them in, and so that we can just shoot them off into the room and go and get my coffee and sit down and listen. How much value are we placing on that church and that child's experience of church? I think that is a big challenge as well. And how do we show value to that? And one of the weird things there is when you separate people out, you've got that disconnect. So the classic parent response or carer response after Sunday is, so what did you learn today? And you've got children look at the ceiling and like, I was expected to learn something. I had a biscuit. I had a really, really heavily diluted squash. But other than that, I've got a blank here.
Well, similar. If the child was to ask the parent, "What did you learn?"
So actually, one of the beauties of doing something like DMM together intergenerational is actually you all hear what you're all learning the same thing, and you're all applying it specifically to you, and you can all kind of keep each other accountable, because you're going to ask each other next week, do you remember what we the story I forgot to say we retell last week's story, and then we hold each other accountable on the bits and pieces that we're doing. And so I think that it's really hard under separate models to each other share an experience, because it's not a shared experience. And we can do the things. Rachel talked about how she used to write, this is what we've been learning, this is what we've been doing, and our main teaching point is, and that's a really nice tool to share with parents. Actually, these are the bits that we've been doing. Again, those that are lining up to take their child back along with their heavily decorated paper plate it's more of a transactional relationship, and so engagement with that is low. Probably there might be somebody who takes a cheeky snap of it and says, "Oh, I'll remember to look at that later on." But I think the challenge is, how do you make sure that you share experience that you can then talk about? Shared experience is really powerful.
Yeah, I mean, guys, there's so much that you've said that's so helpful, so challenging. I think it's what we're requiring is cultural change, philosophical change about how we think about church and ministry and children. And that's what I've really got from this conversation. We're out of time, but there's so much we could talk about. So I'm going to have to get you guys to come back and do more for us, or how perhaps a good way of ending this would be, how can people get in touch with you so you can help churches and church leadership teams take further many of the things that you've thrown out in today's conversation, James and Rachel?
So if you go to our website, cym.ac.uk, you'll find all about the courses that we offer, and have all of our contact details. And we do consultancy bits and pieces, but we love the church. We want to serve the church. We want to see it fulfill its mission of bringing glory to God. So we're always up. We're talking through how we can support and help. One of the things that we're doing quite a lot with churches who are saying, we can't recruit a children's worker who actually knows what they want to do. We're actually using our undergraduate, postgraduate degree to create scholarships to support the training and development of philosophy and talking points across leadership teams there. So yeah, I guess that is the best way to get in contact with us.
Yeah,
That's great. And Rachel?
you've got books also, but I would also encourage you to pick up a module every once in a while if you want. So like I'm doing a 4-day intergenerational module where we're going to go into the theory of it, the theology of it, and the practice of it. And there may be people within your churches that would like to go more and to pick up a module at CYM of the theology of the child, and just to dip in. It's not an all or nothing. You don't have to do an entire MA or nothing, but there are often ways that you can engage to not just be on your own, because I think particularly for me, this kind of stuff, you need to be able to go, I think that's wrong, or I think I fundamentally disagree, or what about this? And to have a robust a community to bat this around and not feel on your own, so that you sometimes can do when you read a book and you go, well, now like I feel overwhelmed, and to have a bunch of experienced people to go along the journey with can be really powerful as well.
That's really, really helpful. And we'll put links to all of the things that you've shared, some of the books that you've referenced, and your own books in the description to today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us today and for beginning the conversation. And hopefully many of the church leaders listening to this will be now thinking through fresh eyes and lenses about children in their church and discipleship. So yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for asking the questions
Yeah.
and being curious about it. It's a real honor to get to walk this with you.